Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to Flight 571 or 571, and this was suggested to me about a week ago when I last streamed, and I was going to do the reaction, but I wrote it down so I could get to the reaction, and I've got to it now. I've not heard of this before. I don't know what this is going to be about. Maybe when it actually gets into it I'll remember certain parts, but other than that I don't think I've ever seen anything to do with this. But the actual video is a true story behind a rugby team's plane crash in the Andes. And just reading the description, on October 13, 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers, including the Old Christians Uruguayan rugby team, crashed in the Andes between Chile and Argentina. The Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 survivors believed they would be rescued within days. They could not have predicted how long their ordeal would last, or that they would become famous as the Andes Mountains cannibals. Wait, what? Of the 27 passengers who survived the impact, only 16 returned home alive when they were finally rescued over 2 months after the crash. In order to survive on the Andes mountainside, the rugby team crash survivors were forced to consume the flesh of fellow passengers who passed away. Oh no. Oh god, what have I got myself into here? I mean, at least it says they passed away, but did they kill them? Oh, this is gonna be a wild ride. You suggested it, so this is why we're doing it. Fucking hell, this is gonna be a wild ass story. But yeah, if you want more stuff like this, suggest it in the comments. You know how it is. The more suggested certain things are, the more likely it will be to be reacted to. And yeah, shout out to my Instagram, my Twitter, links in the description for those interested in following. Same for my page, all links were there. But let's just jump into this one.
On October 13th, 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers, including an entire professional rugby team, crashed in the Andes Mountains between Chile and Argentina. There was no way the survivors could have known it at the time, but their nightmare had only just begun. Their story has been called the Miracle of the Andes, on account of the incredible odds the survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had to overcome to make it home. Today, we're going to take a look at the true story behind the movie Alive and the crash of Uruguayan Flight 571 in the Andes. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other unbelievable survival stories you would like to hear about. Excuse me, everybody, this is your captain. Okay, brace yourself.
I might have to sub this channel. If this channel does content specifically like this or weird ass stories, I might have to check it out again. Does anyone watching this know about this channel? Because if you do and you want more reactions, please let me know some certain videos you'd want to see.
The rugby team aboard Flight 571 wasn't terribly alarmed when the pilot told them they were about to encounter some turbulence. They were en route to a match in Chile, and most had their minds on the coming game. But at least one of the passengers, a 19-year-old medical student named Roberto Canessa, recalls someone near him asking, "Aren't we flying too close to the mountains?" Moments later, his fear was realized when the plane hit...
How do you fly too low? I know that the mountains are very high up, but how do you fly so low that you're like level with the mountains? Like, surely you know there's a level that you should be at, especially as a pilot. Or do planes typically, when they fly over mountains, literally do they not go much higher than the mountains are? Because I've never been on a plane, so I don't actually know how much higher than the mountains they would usually be. But yeah, I mean, I don't know why it would be this low.
At the side of a mountain. The crash was later attributed to an error made by the pilot. While still flying high amongst the Andes Mountains, the pilot turned north to begin the descent into Santiago, Chile. But the peaks were still too high where they were. Realizing his mistake, the pilot attempted to increase the altitude by tilting the plane nearly fully vertical, which caused the plane to stall. The engine sputtered and the plane descended, and that's when it hit the mountain.
A recipe for disaster. Jesus Christ.
Dr. Roberto Canessa would eventually write the book, I Had to Survive, How a Plane Crash in the Andes Inspired My Calling to Save Lives, in which he would detail exactly how he felt after the plane hit the mountain. He reported that his body lurched forward upon impact and he immediately struck his head. His first thought was that his life was about to end. He held on tight to his seat and he began to pray. Someone nearby yelled, "Please God, help me," while another person shouted that he was blind. When Canessa looked over at the screaming passenger, he saw that the man's brain was literally spilling out of his head.
What? Oh my god. Fucking hell, his brain... Ugh, Jesus. I'm just sort of picturing it. Oh my days.
When the plane finally came to a stop, all of the seats pushed forward toward the cockpit like a row of dominoes. The smell of jet fuel and the sounds of screaming filled the air. The crash split the fuselage of the plane wide open. It broke apart and the tail was nowhere in sight. The rugby team, along with their friends and family who had been aboard the flight, found themselves stranded, surrounded by snow-capped mountains in the midst of a raging blizzard. After the crash, the team gathered whatever food and warm clothes they could find in the wreckage. Convinced that a rescue mission would arrive quickly, they took their empty suitcases and used them to make a cross on the ground that they believed would be easily visible from the sky. They also used their footsteps to carve an SOS message in the snow for planes that might be flying overhead. On the second day, they heard both a jet and a smaller plane fly over them. Both times, the survivors became elated, feeling sure that a rescue was imminent. But day after day came and went with no sign of help.
Bro, that must be such a horrible thought, man. You have all this hope of someone coming to save you, and you see planes or whatever coming, like, well, yeah, planes or helicopters going above you, thinking they're going to save you. Like, that hope, and then sort of the feeling that you must have after that sort of feeling of hope must be so bad. This is like one of the worst situations anyone could be in. Like, how you initially survive, but then you've got to deal with your injuries whilst in these conditions. Food shortages, just everything. It's just like, man, I can't really predict what's gonna happen, but I just want to, like, I'm really interested in knowing, which is why I'm gonna unpause it soon, and intrigued to see how they got themselves out of the situation. Obviously, they turned to eating human flesh, which, wow. But I mean, in that sort of situation that we're gonna see, I assume you've got to do what you've got to do, right? Oh my god. An avalanche is... How unlucky are you, man? So you've got all this, and then piled on top of it, you've got a bloody avalanche. Oh my Jesus.
Flight 571 took off with 45 people aboard. 12 of those perished in the crash, and 5 more succumbed to their injuries within hours. Another person died 1 week later from injuries sustained in the crash. And on the 17th day, disaster struck again. A sudden avalanche swept over the crash site, where another 8 people met their demise. The survivors lacked food, which made starvation their #1 concern. However, they were also trapped at an altitude of 11,800 feet, which meant that their second biggest problem was the unrelenting freezing temperatures.
Man, how unlucky.
To stay alive, the survivors of Flight 571 had to get clever. To get drinking water, they used a section of aluminum from one of the plane seats to melt the snow. They also needed to stay warm, so they disassembled all of the wool seat covers to form blankets. Walking around in the deep snow wasn't easy, so they figured out they could use seat bottoms as snowshoes. They used the fuselage as shelter, and to block the cold air from getting inside, they packed suitcases into the open spaces. Sunglasses were fabricated from plastic that was found in the pilot's cabin. Hammocks were constructed for people with broken legs, and sleeping bags were made from insulation pulled from the plane's kitchen. When it came to bodily functions, the survivors would urinate into rugby balls, because if they tried to do it outside in the snow, their urine would freeze. Roberto Canet for moving the corpse to...
What? Wait, you're telling me if they pissed, just openly, the piss would have just frozen to their body? Is that actually true? It doesn't freeze that quick, does it? I mean, I know it's very cold in these temperatures, but it wouldn't just instantly freeze, would it? Wait, what? That's a wild ass
Tried to do it outside in the snow, their urine would freeze. Roberto Canessa, just a young medical student at the time, used his nascent skills to nurse the injured. He drained fluids and stabilized fractured bones. He also assumed responsibility for moving the corpses, a job some couldn't bring themselves to do. In an interview with National Geographic, Dr. Canessa later reflected on the ingenuity of the survivors, saying that you get very smart when you are dying.
Yeah, you gotta dig deep, ain't you? You gotta think of every situation.
It was 9 days after the crash that the food ran out. The land around the crash site had no vegetation,
here's where
and
it
there were no
comes.
animals at that altitude either, so hunting or foraging was out of the question. With nothing to sustain them, it was only a few days before they were all feeling the symptoms of starvation. The survivors were aware that if they waited too long to eat, they would be too weak to survive. They were also aware that the bodies of the deceased passengers lay preserved in the packed snow, not too far from the fuselage.
Lay preserved. I mean, fuck. But I mean, he's not, in terms of how it actually is, it's not wrong, because obviously it's kept their bodies from rotting away. But just the idea of that, like, oh man, this is about to get so mad, I swear to God.
It didn't take long to realize what the only option really was. Many of the survivors resisted, and some of them prayed to God, asking for guidance as to whether or not they should
Poor
resort to
people,
eating their
man.
fellow passengers and teammates. There was plenty of discussion among the team, but in the end, starvation led to action. As a medical student,
Oh.
Roberto Canessa knew that human tissue contains proteins and fat, like any other kind of meat. He knew that it would be sufficient for sustaining the starving survivors, and as the closest thing they had to a doctor, he felt confident about being the first to cut into one of the corpses. In his memoir, Canessa would later write about the mental barrier he encountered when he tried to eat his friend. For him, it was one thing to know at an intellectual level that you were hungry and needed food to live. But it was another thing entirely to know that the so-called food in one's hand is from the body of a loved one.
Man, imagine, like, the mental side effects this is going to have on you in the moment, but probably for the rest of your life. Oh man, like, again, you're eating your friends, your I guess family, maybe. Oh my. Actually, I guess it's not family because it's a rugby team, so I guess it's just their teammates and stuff. Oh no, this is one of the craziest stories I've seen on YouTube. Now I see why you were suggesting this. I mean, I do find these sorts of stories interesting, but there's levels to it, and this is like wild in every way. Like, I'm baffled right now. I never really thought of anything like this before. This is like the worst nightmare, all put into one thing.
The experience for the survivors was, needless to say, unbelievably stressful. Canessa used a shard of glass to slice into the first body, and each survivor took a piece, forcing themselves to consume it on the spot. Every survivor...
Oh my god, they didn't even cook! They lit... Oh my god. I mean, obviously they didn't cook it, but... Because obviously there's no way they can, but I didn't even think about that either. Nah, this is nuts!
Except one. Coche and Searte initially refused to take part, as he could not stomach the idea. Eventually, though, even he gave in, and ate to stay alive. Technically speaking, what the survivors did is not cannibalism per se. That term usually refers to the devious means in order to consume a person. What the survivors did is actually known as anthropophagy. Despite the pedantics, the survivors realized the severity of their actions and vowed to consider it a sacred act. Of the then 10 remains they had, they deemed 3 of them off limits. Those were the bodies of Fernando Parrado's mother and sister and Javier Methal's nephew. All of the survivors had serious difficulties committing to the idea of eating another human being. To come to grips with the situation, Canessa and the others reasoned that if the situation was reversed, they would want their own bodies to be used for food. Canessa felt the act of eating another person connected the two physically and spiritually. With all in agreement, the survivors vowed that if they themselves perished, they would willingly donate themselves so the others could live. During the avalanche that hit on the 17th day, the frozen bodies that the team were living off of were all swept away.
And it gets worse. Quick question: is there any like knowledge on what parts of the body they ate? Was it just sort of like the, I guess the fat, like fat? I don't know, the fatty parts of your body, muscle. I guess muscles as well, but I don't know if that's chewable. If it's just too like chewy, or would they have like eaten like the hearts? Just oh my god. Oh.
However,
man.
the avalanche also resulted in the
Like organs as well.
loss of 8 additional passengers.
So you've gone through all this, and then there's people who've done all this, and then they've ended up being killed by the avalanche. Man, this is how unlucky can a single person be?
The survivors once
Let 'em
again
in a group
faced an
of
agonizing
people.
decision. Should they consume their friends, who only hours earlier had been living and breathing?
Oh my.
After more discussion, Canessa and the others once again decided to do what they must to survive, and they fed off the newly lost passengers. Though they were stranded, the team wasn't totally cut off from the outside world. They used a transistor radio to hear about the search efforts being made to find them. But on October 23, 1972, they heard some gravely distressing news. After over 100 attempts to locate the crashed plane, the authorities were calling off the search. The survivors
What?
realized that if they were going to make it home, they would have to get help themselves. Soon afterwards, Canessa, Nando Parado, and Antonio Tintin Vicentin set out on a hike to find rescue. They reached the top of the mountain, but once they got there, they realized they were still far from finding safety. Tintin was sent back to the plane so that Canessa and Parado could better divide their meager food rations. At night, they endured sub-zero temperatures, but after 10 days of walking, they reached a spot that had grass and
10
water,
days.
and they suddenly felt confident that they were going to survive. Canessa and Parado hiked 10 days and 44 miles before they finally found someone who could help them. It was 70 days after the initial crash when they finally emerged back into civilization. It was 70 days.
70 days. Oh nah. 70 days enduring this kind of chaos. And they still managed to say, like, bro, these are superhuman people.
After the initial crash, when they finally emerged back into civilization. The two then led authorities to the crash site, where the rest of the survivors were saved. Considering their severe malnutrition and the incredibly dangerous terrain they walked across, Canessa and Parado's feat was nothing short of astonishing.
There was serious backlash over the What? I guess because of the eating of humans, but it's easy to say that if you're in the situation. I mean, I don't know. I honestly don't know what I could do. I don't think I could bring myself to do it. But at the same time, hunger does some serious things to people's mental sort of thoughts and just like you would just do things that you wouldn't expect. I don't know why there would be backlash. I mean, I guess I do, but it's a sticky one. But I'd definitely side with the survivors without a doubt because they were there for 70 days. What
On
else
December
do you expect?
22nd, 1972, 2 helicopters were sent to find the survivors still living in the plane wreckage. 6 were immediately flown home, but 8 others had to wait until the next day due to poor weather conditions.
Oh, man.
The rescue made all the headlines, but reactions quickly shifted from joyous amazement to shock and disgust when word got out about what the team had to do to survive. It wasn't until the survivors were able to express their own hesitations about their actions and describe the spiritual battle that ensued over the decision that the public was swayed to support them. Especially troubling was that the church took issue with the survivors' actions. However, once they explained that they had treated the consumption of their friends as an act of communion,
That's a
the
wild
church
picture.
absolved them of their sins. After the rescue, Canessa set out to meet the parents of all those who had perished. He took them the letters the dead had written before they passed away. He felt strongly about telling the survivors' side of the story and making sure the circumstances of their plight were well understood. Canessa knew how taboo what they had done was, and he believed no one would be more outraged than those of the families of the deceased. But in the end, he found he was met with understanding and forgiveness from the families of the victims. They all seemed to understand living was more important than anything else. So what do you think? What would you do to survive in a similar...
This is absolutely flight. Wait, 571. I want to see if any of the survivors are still alive today. Wait. So this is one of the people. Poor people, man. It's important to know that these men were in top physical condition. One of the reasons they survived such a harsh environment. Yeah, actually, the fact that they're rugby players, that makes sense. actually. I was wondering how they would survive for so long, but yeah, I guess when they're built like that, it helps a lot. Imagine being stuck in basically Helheim, knowing you would die without eating the flesh of the dead, and when finally being rescued, being shot on by a privileged public. Do not pray for an easy life. Pray for the strength to endure a difficult one. I can't imagine surviving a plane crash and dying in an avalanche. These people really went through hell. It's crazy, man. I don't know how. I feel like I've never seen bits of this before, but I didn't ever see a whole story in it. I just sort of saw it on like a top 10 list of whatever, but I don't actually know if I did. But this is probably the craziest story I've ever seen. Like, it's just ridiculous. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I mean, the fact that anyone survived is beyond me. It's crazy what humans can do when they're put in this kind of situation. Some humans can do, because I can tell you one thing for sure. I would not come out alive of this situation. That is for sure, man. But yeah, this is a crazy ass story, and people suggested it. If you have any other videos like this you want to see, maybe videos from this channel, because this is a pretty good video, to be fair. I enjoyed it quite. And I enjoyed learning from it. I didn't enjoy the actual video. But yeah, if you want more reactions from this channel or videos like this, just suggest it in the comments. And yeah, until next time, like, subscribe. Peace.